Hi, welcome to the first feedback loop for the Southwest Sydney co-design process for alternatives to ED. So we'd like to welcome everybody who's joining us today, as well as anyone who is watching this webinar at a later stage. Just going to share my screen with everyone now so that we can see the slides that we have for today's session. Okay. So we'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're all on, and we're all located in different areas, but in particular to recognise the traditional custodians of the land on which these safe havens are going to be set up. So they will be set up in Darug land and Darawal land, and we'd like to pay our respects to the Darug and Darawal people, and also pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. It's also important to acknowledge the leadership role that has been taken by Aboriginal people in designing new services for suicide prevention and new approaches to suicide prevention. We'd also like to acknowledge all the people who are contributing to this process, and we're hoping will contribute to the survey that we're going to have links to at the end of this presentation. All of those people who bring the expertise of lived experience to this process, and that lived experience is just so unique and valuable to what we're doing in co-design. So as we go through these slides that I'm showing you today, we're not actually going to read through everything that you will see on the slide. These slides are being reproduced in the survey that there'll be a link to at the end of this session. We really encourage you to spread that link as widely as possible so that as many people as possible can provide us their perspective. So what will happen is, if you're watching this at a later stage, or if you are looking at the copies of the slides that are provided in that survey, just encourage you to take the time to read any other information that you'd like to get about the information that's been shared with us by people with lived experience in the Southwest Sydney area. So far we've had a great co-design process. It's involved bringing together small groups of people with lived experience and small groups of health professionals to find out what their experiences are like when somebody's trying to access help during a suicidal crisis through the emergency department, and to tell us a little bit about needs. And we'll provide you the information that's come out of that process today. We've also brought a larger group of people with lived experience and a larger group of health professionals together to talk about some of the broader issues. And that will also be fed back to you today in this feedback loop. And the purpose of this feedback loop is to not just let you know what we've been told by people in the Southwest Sydney area already about what you need and what you would like to see in these new safe havens, but also to really give people who haven't been involved in the process so far that opportunity to join in and have their voices heard. So what I'm presenting to you now is the information and the experiences that were shared with us from people who have a lived experience of suicide. And that's including people in Southwest Sydney who have experienced suicidal thoughts, people who have survived a suicide attempt, people who have cared for someone who has been in a suicidal crisis or who has attempted suicide, and also people who have been bereaved through suicide. And what we did was we had a chat with people about how they felt when they were either themselves trying to access help during a suicidal crisis through the emergency department, or how they felt when they were supporting someone else to do that. So I'm going to take you through what came out of those conversations now. And again, I really encourage you, I'm only going to read out a few of the comments on each slide, but all you have to do is stop the recording or pause it, and you can have a read of the rest of those comments as well, or have a look in the survey where the slides are reproduced. So for each stage of that journey of trying to find help through the emergency department, we asked people, what were you feeling and why were you feeling that way? So we first talked about how people felt when they were trying to find help and trying to find out how to access that support and that help through the emergency department. And the big feelings that came out of that conversation were that it was heartbreaking, that people felt desperate and felt very anxious. And a lot of people said how difficult it was. Just a few of the reasons that were given for feeling this way. One person said, in terms of supporting her nephew to go to the emergency department, she said, my nephew wouldn't go willingly, so had to find hospital via a first responder. Another person told me that given my lived experience of not wanting to take anyone to ED unless it was an absolute resort. We then asked people about their feelings when they arrived at the emergency department and during that first assessment that takes place. And the big feelings that were expressed about that were they felt resented, they felt like a burden, that it was frustrating and humiliating. And some of the other feelings that came up for people was it was overwhelming, that some people did have high hopes, some people felt relieved, and others found it quite scary. And the reasons for that were quite diverse, but one person told us that being assessed from a medical-oriented perspective, I felt that the ED practitioner was ticking boxes around physical health with no knowledge of psychosocial support needs. Another person told us there's no privacy, that it's not the environment to disclose sensitive and personal issues. Accessing help through the emergency department during a suicidal crisis can involve a number of periods of waiting, and we asked people what that was like for them. And the strongest feeling that was expressed around that waiting was anger. And you can see there's a whole lot of other feelings that people felt. People felt helpless and degraded. Some felt guilty about what was going on. When we asked people why they were feeling this way, one person told us, another patient came in who was highly distressed. She was left in the corner trying to self-soothe. Other patients had to fill in the void in care. It was pointed out to us that people in Southwest Sydney can sit in the ED for 24 to 36 hours. And another person told us, I was left in the corridor. We also asked those people who received treatment what that was like for them. And it was an experience that left people feeling not valued. Some people mentioned feeling criminalised. Some people were made to feel like they were a liar. But again, there's a whole range of feelings that have come up there. The reasons that were given for this, one person told us, it feels like we don't give a damn about you and we don't value you due to your mental health issues. Another person said that the seclusion room is particularly traumatizing, but there was another person that expressed a fairly positive experience. They said that deeper engagement with a psychiatrist made for a positive experience. When we asked people about how they felt when they left, whether that be leaving directly from the emergency department and going home or leaving after treatment, and the biggest feelings that were expressed there was that people felt angry and people felt unsupported. There were a range of reasons for this. One person told us follow-up was a big issue, that they were left feeling confused and not understanding what's next. Another person said, after having such a bad experience, I never returned to ED. And quite a number of general comments were made about people's experiences, but just some that we'd like to raise during this webinar, that Southwest Sydney is severely underserviced, that the emergency department is not the environment at all that can support someone in a time of crisis, and also that they felt people were treated like a number and shoved to the side. We also asked people who either have never accessed the emergency department during a suicidal crisis or may have done so in the past but would never consider doing it again. And we asked them reasons for that. And these are actually some really important reasons for you to read through when you get the chance. But just to point out some of those, that telling a story over and over again is frustrating. Also the shame involved in the process, and that they make you wait for 4.5 hours when you could be in bed. So we ask people with lived experience on the basis of what you've had happen when you've gone and tried to access help through the emergency department. What needs do a safe haven need to meet? Okay. So we've got a whole lot of things we're going to point out here. This is actually quite important information. So in terms of support, people with lived experience have told us they need someone to talk to, options of what support is available, assistance to find out what you need, a plan with a follow-up, treatment for any physical or medical injury, very clear, detailed and ready available information, directed support for carers, both supporting the loved one and themselves, linked in with other services outside the hospital, own strategies for maintaining wellness, re-entry planning, and then in terms of the experience, people would like to be provided nourishment such as water, food, bathroom and sleep, to be provided distraction from their thoughts and feelings, and to have their senses less heightened. They'd like to be able to focus their mind on one thing and to be able to do the things that they already do for self-care. People with lived experience want the workers in the safe space to have an understanding of where you're at. They'd like there to be agreement on what should happen next and that decisions should not be made on people's behalf. Also that there be actual conversations rather than people just being told. They'd like continuity of communication and the involvement and inclusion of family, and that advice is not provided in an arrogant way. In terms of emotional needs, people with lived experience have said they need to know that they're in a safe space, and that includes safety for yourself and the people around you. There needs to be privacy and confidentiality, and knowing that the information that is provided in the safe haven is not going to be shared. They'd like to feel like they're not being watched and have hope and optimism, but it needs to be authentic and genuine and not fake or condescending optimism. They'd like to be acknowledged, taken seriously and believed. And I think that was a direct response to a lot of people being made to feel like they were a liar when they were talking about their needs, when they were accessing help through the emergency department. They need to feel worth and feel respected, and carers need to be valued as having expertise. There needs to be a sense of being able to manage upon leaving. So the idea that people feel like they can cope when they leave, and also that confidence in what you've just experienced. In terms of the environment and accessibility, people with lived experience in Southwest Sydney would like a calming and non-clinical environment where there's an immediate response and people are able to talk to someone right away. They'd like to be welcomed on arrival, and there to be knowledge and transparency around what the procedures are in the safe haven. They would like the haven to be available at all times and for there to be awareness in the community and expectations on what's available. And there was a lot of conversation around the need for consideration of cultural and language needs and barriers. In terms of connection, people need to be welcomed with open arms, and they want somebody to offer compassion and empathy. They'd like to feel confident in the knowledge and training of the staff in the safe haven. They'd like someone to give attention without a person being labelled as attention seeking. Someone to speak up for you or your family, so an advocate of some form, particularly if dealing with the police or ambulance or clinicians. Also general conversations, and they'd like to feel listened to. They would like that there'd be one person that they can continuously speak with, also to manage expectations and show respect. And recognising when somebody is new to the space, when it's their first time that they've actually come into the space. They'd say it's important that we make sure that things that have been asked for and are agreed to are followed through, that there's regular contact and updates, and that staff are upfront and honest and not assuming you know things and you don't have to ask questions repeatedly. They'd like for onward connection with other services and to actually be handed over so that you don't have to repeat your story and the next step of receiving support. And also someone to make contact afterwards and monitor your plan.
Thanks, Tina. Yeah. you're handing over to me?
I am.
Thanks, Tina. So I get to do the exciting part, which is to feedback some of the ideas that came about what would, if people could just sit in that blue sky thinking that we asked people to do during a co-design process. So what's the ideal safe space look like locally? What are some of your best and brightest ideas about how to create an ideal local safe space? And this is what people with lived experience told us in the workshop that we facilitated actually last year now. So in terms of, we've just sort of grouped these in terms of some broad themes. So in terms of purpose, the aim is to support people through the process. Priority should be given for the person in crisis, but carers can go there to find out what they need to do also. There was a lot of discussion around that because we did have the carer perspective in the room, and so there is a lot of discussion and the need for further exploration about what does the role of the safe space play in terms of supporting carers and the people that love and care for people in crisis. Also a place that people can continue to go as they need. So it's available there. It's not just a one-off support for people. And the safe space takes a more holistic approach. It could be that people are referred to the SPOT team, which is the suicide prevention outreach team that's being established in the region to do more individualised work, and that it shouldn't be a drug and alcohol treatment centre or a general drop-in space. And then in terms of location and physical environment, there was a broad agreement about the need for it to be near to hospital but not on hospital grounds, to be close to public transport, to also, this came out very strongly, to look very different from going to a clinical space, that it's a homely and welcoming environment. Some people, there was a suggestion that it should be an actual cafe, not just to look like one. So that there would actually be the kind of things that you would get in a cafe there, that there should be a garden outside, and this sense of openness is critical, that art should be there that people have created themselves, and also flexibility with the space, so that there's of the actual physical space, a mix of room and spaces. People talked about the need that some people might need a private space and some people would prefer an open one. And then also that when people enter, that there's a nice frontage, not just offices and rooms, and then also disability access. Thanks, Tina. And then in terms of what we're calling here sort of broadly the experience that guests will, what the guest experience will be like, that staff would come and welcome you and approach you when you enter as a guest to the safe haven, that there'd be one-on-one time for supporting someone, that there really is that ability for what they're calling the SP peer workers, so the specialist peer workers are able to have that one-on-one time with someone, supporting someone, that there is something that you can do with other people. So recognizing again that people will have different needs at different times, and that people can access and enter the space discreetly, that there are guidelines for connecting people with other services, recognizing that that's a very important aspect of people who may be experiencing suicidal crisis. There will be a range of factors that are contributing to that, and so they may need to access other supports. Also, to have someone able to walk you to the ED or the other way around if needed. So that's in recognition of the fact that there is no formal referral pathway in or out of the safe space. Staff don't have offices they go into, so it's a genuinely open plan that the staff would be located within the general physical space, that there is cultural inclusivity and access to translators. So that speaks to what Tina was saying before. There was a real emphasis, we've heard it very clearly in this local process, about the diversity of different cultural groups and communities within this LHD, that it's important not to overcomplicate sort of any kind of assessment type protocol, just to simply ask people, how are you, what's going on, and what do you need? And that there was also, some people had strong views around the idea that you can't have ambulance or police showing up, particularly given people's previous traumatic experiences, that sometimes people have had those with traditional kind of crisis responses. And then in terms of, we asked people with lived experience locally, how does the safe haven, how do people hear about it in the community? How do you provide sort of general community awareness? What is the process for that? So education for community members that the safe space exists, direct people on how and when to access it. So more sort of detailed information around that. Just generally global awareness, including, so that a cross-sectoral kind of awareness of people that are kind of key gatekeepers and stakeholders here. So ambulance, police, ED staff, mental health services, private practice counsellors as well. That there should be a database of services that know about the safe haven and that they have up-to-date information. To advertise via the internet or social media, and social marketing campaigns that target specific groups. Schools as well, there's somewhere where there needs to be information, we were told, and also information in GPs and doctors' surgeries. Thanks, Tina. And then in terms of staffing, what people with lived experience told us very clearly was that they needed to have staff there that were very client-focused, welcoming and understanding. Someone said staff with the right motives. Staff need to be identifiable, not lost in the space. So there was some discussion around whether staff would have some kind of way of indicating via their clothing that they're peer workers. Name tags but dressed casually was a suggestion. That the staff is just approachable and available, and that the staff, someone suggested the staff probably will need clinical support but don't want them conspiring, was the term that they used. And then also identified peer workers or liaison officer roles. So the idea again that there needs to be in identified positions, for example, Indigenous, multicultural, and that there should be gender diversity, like genuine gender diversity within the peer workforce. In terms of the service model, people with lived experience locally said that it's important to let people know about services that are available. Information should be available for carers. Again, that was emphasised, family and friends, both in how to support people and what support there is available for them. Training sessions could be held on an ongoing basis. And if there was a need for direct clinical support, then someone is able to be directed, referred or connected onwards. Also, what's important is active listening, that conversation needs to be guided by the client, not the worker. That there needs to be a capacity to ask people questions around safety, but in a sensitive way. That advice that draws on someone's lived experience could be an important part of the model, and that advice about what to do from here and what might help, but not, someone said, but not in an arrogant way. So just that idea from some people with lived experience saying that they would like sort of that kind of practical wisdom that comes from peer workers having a meaningful shared experience, and also that on the ground knowledge about the availability of local services and what might or might not work for people. Thanks, Tina. And then look, we're really aware that we've got a lot of information to get through, and we're not wanting to, we really appreciate that people take the time. And as Tina said, we're wanting people to pause and look through this at their leisure, or just to actually, when you follow up and do the survey, all of these slides will be available. So really to dig into the information there. But what we do at this point in the process is we collate it, the perspectives of people with lived experience. We've also had those conversations, as Tina told you, with health professionals as well, and they're put into what we call a traffic light system by Beacon Strategies, who does all of this behind the scenes work of collating the information, turning it around, and putting it into these presentations for you. And so I think what'll be worthwhile is taking you through this, knowing that you can go back and have a look in detail or look at this in the survey. But what I'd like to show you now is where we're up to in terms of alignment with what the ministry requires, and then the alignment or divergence so far between people with lived experience and health professionals. You'll come to see that there's a lot of alignment actually already. So thanks, Tina. I'll just show you what the core elements that are needing agreement through this local processes are. So values, what will the safe haven hold itself to? Service model, what support will people receive at the safe haven? Connection pathways to the safe haven. So the question here is, how will people access the local safe havens? And then outward connections and partnerships. So where will the safe haven connect people to, when and why? Then in terms of physical environment and accessibility, what does the local safe haven look and feel like? How do people access it? Staffing, who will deliver support at the local safe havens? Workforce development, how will staff capability be developed over time? Then this sort of larger issue of governance, who will be involved in overseeing, clinical, potentially clinical and operational aspects of the safe haven. And then finally, the location of the safe haven. Where will the safe haven be established ideally? Now, you'll see from these, just from me going through those elements, some of those, a lot of those ideas that I've just presented to you that the lived experience people provided are what you'll now see in the traffic light slides, threaded through the traffic light slides according to these elements. But we'll also show you what the health professionals told us as well. Thanks, Tina. So in terms of the values, these are pretty much determined broadly now. Firstly, there was a co-design, a forum that kicked off this whole co-design process at a statewide level by the ministry. And these are what came out of that kind of, that forum of a very diverse range of stakeholders, including people with lived experience. And these were person-centered, risk-tolerant, non-judgmental, welcoming, responsive, compassionate, strengths-focused, hopeful, holistic, self-determination, empowerment, human connection, collaboration, integration, respectful, evidence-based, dignity, inclusion, and choice. And as you'll see, they're not all strictly values. Some of them are more like, I guess, principles, practice principles, and maybe also just an approach to a non-clinical service. And then you can see here, and there's quite a lot of overlap and similarity from the lived experience perspective in this region. The people that came to the workshop and did some work on determining the values locally, it was empathy, compassion, care, professionalism, acceptance, honesty, open-mindedness, non-judgmental, confidentiality, respect, boundaries, transparency, acknowledgement, validity, authenticity, equality, welcoming, life experience, understanding, and humility. And we'll be doing a bit more work in the final session to just boil these down to some core values that can really guide the local safe havens. Thanks, Tina. We'll also be asking people, the co-design participants, to develop a set of principles. So principles that can really guide every aspect of the local safe havens, and that will really provide a kind of a bit of a moral compass, I guess, in a way, for how the local safe havens operate. Thanks, Tina. So just a reminder, as I said, we've got this traffic light system. So where you'll see green is alignment between the Ministry of Health statewide requirements, the lived experience input to date, and the health professional input to date. Orange is, and that's what I'll really get you to take a close look at here. It's for further discussion to explore potential areas of divergence, either between the local perspectives and the ministry, or between lived experience people locally and health professionals to date. And what you'll find in terms of the red text, that's stuff that's out of scope according to the ministry and what it requires in terms of its funding and what it's going to be funding. But there isn't actually much that we've found so far that is out of scope. So thanks, Tina. So in terms of the service model, you'll see lots of green here between the ministry requirements, the lived experience local perspective, and the local health professional perspective. So just drawing your attention to the areas that require further exploration. If any of them jump out to you as things that you have strong views about, or that you know people that would have a professional perspective on, or some lived expertise around, really encourage you to get them to spread the word about the survey, get them to have their say. The broadest community input is the best for a local safe haven that will actually really be effective and sustainable in the region. So training sessions, so the suggestion that I took you through before, the idea about training sessions, so that is, it's not out of scope, but it's just something that requires further explanation. And the idea of follow-up, technically there isn't a kind of a formal follow-up protocol with safe spaces. They're a drop-in, non-clinical drop-in space. So what does that look like locally? Also the need to understand and support guests presenting with suicidal thoughts related to domestic violence experience. So that is something that's potentially is requiring specialist training or skills in, where what do people think about that? Is that an important feature for you, and how would that work? Then you can see one thing in red here, clinical services could be included as they play an important part. And of course, that's out of scope in a service that's being funded by the ministry, where they explicitly state that clinical services are not provided. What is delivered in the service must be non-clinical. Thanks, Tina. So this is the general question we ask, and we'll encourage you to also just to respond to these general questions. How will guests, carers, families or friends be supported? Thanks, Tina. And then in terms of connection pathways to the safe haven, knowing that there's no requirement by the ministry has said there's no requirement for people to present to an ED prior to accessing the service. So some of the things that we'd like you to have a further input on is here from a lived experience perspective, the idea that there might be some form of assessment. So the ministry, as you can see on the left here, says that there's no requirement to undertake any kind of assessment. And then also police or ambulance don't show up or be visible to guests. So what would that look like? Are there going to be times when there needs to be a first responder kind of response, and how does that work? What does that look like? If so, if you have a strong view about the fact that that shouldn't happen, then we really encourage you to have your say there too. And then uncertainty around the no wrong door approach versus the possibility of a space being open for anyone. So again, as we heard before, that there was concerns around it becoming a drug and alcohol treatment sort of type space or just a general drop-in space. So just wanting more information from people about what does a no wrong door approach look like that is also able to account for those potential issues that have been identified. Thanks, Tina. And then outward connections. So these are all, as you can see, all in green here. So the general question, which we'll move on to now, is just these are some of the general questions around the connection pathways to and from your local safe havens. How will the service be promoted in the community or other health services and community organisations? What support does the district need from the ministry around communication and promotion to the broader community? What partnerships will support local connections to and from services for guests of the safe haven? And how will emergency department staff be supported with information and education about your local safe havens? Thanks, Tina. And then in terms of physical environment and accessibility, you'll see here that there's largely a lot of agreement with from both people with lived experience and health professionals locally with the ministry. Just in terms of stuff that needs to be thought through a bit more and talked through is the idea that it should be available at all times. I think everyone comes to this process in the spirit of thinking that ideally it would be a 24/7 proposition, a local safe haven, but resources don't allow for that. So what are the key available times for locally? What are the times of greatest need? The idea of a garden and outdoor area, while that may not be possible, so there will be some constraints. So what do people think about that? And then the mix of rooms and spaces, both open and private. So that probably also speaks to some of the things that can't be co-designed, which is around the limits to the space itself, and then nice frontage upon entry. So that again speaks to the idea that there's going to be a limited range of options in terms of where these things are located. And then of course that the LHD has already done a lot of that work as well. So that's a parallel process. Thanks, Tina. So physical environment accessibility, what we're asking for your perspective on here is what will the opening hours be? What should they be? What will the style of the service be? Cafe, lounge, rooms? How will food and drink be provided? How will the service specifically address the needs of priority groups? And will information be provided in different languages? So we know that those things seem to be very important. We're hearing that loud and clear in this local region. So if you have perspectives, particularly if you have people that belong to those groups that represent are representative of those groups or are community advocates, we really like to hear from them as well. Thanks, Tina. So in terms of staffing, the one thing that we wanted people to provide further input around is sort of the idea that you would have a diversity of peer workers, not just diversity of lived experience, but diversity in terms of gender and also diversity in terms of the social and cultural kind of factors as well. Thanks, Tina. And then workforce development. This is the one here again that staff should have access to clinical support. So that there's been some quite robust conversation around that, given that peer work is a genuinely non-clinical profession and they're working within a non-clinical environment. So what would that look like? How would that work given those parameters? Thanks, Tina. And then the general questions we're asking here is, what is the proposed staffing model for the service, including allocation of 2 FTE for SP peer workers? How will the SP peer workforce be supported? That's probably a very important question. It seems to have come up, this idea of the need for training and ongoing support to guarantee the effectiveness and the sustainability of the SP peer workforce locally. Thanks, Tina. And then in terms of governance, there was a number of things that require further exploration, which makes total sense. Governance is something that needs to be negotiated, and obviously the LHD would be doing work on this as well. So privacy and confidentiality, the idea that information should not be shared. So how does that get balanced out with some of the organisational kind of protocols that exist currently and that typically exist in these kind of traditional governance structures? Then uncertainty around the role of and the need for security. So we've heard this in a couple of contexts actually now, if in a public place. So there was really an understanding that in itself sits in tension with the idea of a trauma-informed, compassion-focused, non-clinical environment. So really wanting to hear people, if you have strong opinions either way, to share those around the role of security and even of ambulance and police, as I said. And then uncertainty around the need for clinical support again. So where does that sit? And then also from a health professional perspective, acknowledgement that training of peer workers will enable them to make judgments, but also the idea that there's a lot of accountability there that comes with that role. And what does that look like? How does that get expressed in a governance structure? Thanks, Tina. So these are the big questions around governance. How will management of the service be reflected in clinical and operational governance structures of the district? What are the key risks in establishing the service? How will they be managed? What arrangements or protocols will be put in place to support referrals to and from the emergency department? There's probably it's probably a little bit misleading that the way that's phrased, in fact, even though that has come from the ministry, given that there isn't a formal referral pathway to and from, but it's really to support people's ability to access, to go back and forward between these services. And then how will people have the opportunity to provide feedback on the service? And then how will outcome data be collected and reported? Thanks, Tina. And then finally, the location. So given that people are aware that some of these decisions get made in more of a top-down way, just based on the fact that there's limits to where these things can be located and how they can be resourced. But some of the things that we still wanted people to really explore is ideally where should, more at a high principle level, where should non-clinical services be located. So lived experience perspective, it was near to hospital but not on hospital ground. So that needs further exploration depending on where these services end up being set up. Close to public transport, and then an actual cafe. And then also from the health professional perspective, someone said that Ambervale would be an ideal place, and I understand that is actually on the cards. That's one of the scouted locations. And then also some concerns around likely drug and alcohol presentations if located near a park. So if people have any strong opinions or views around that, or some professional or lived experience expertise around that, please feel free to contribute those perspectives in the survey. Thanks, Tina. And then the general questions in terms of the location element, where would the safe haven be ideally located in your region? So we'd like to hear from you, do that blue sky thinking, regardless of what actually happens, just so we know that, so that the LHD can know that this is what people's sort of ideal vision of a local safe space is, this is where it would be located. And particularly whether you see it as needing to be located off hospital grounds or on hospital grounds. Thanks, Tina. Okay, so thank you so much for people that have been watching this live and have stuck through this quite laboured process, but we think it's very important that we feed back information in as a transparent a way as possible, so people really can get a window into what's happened so far. It's been a fabulous process. Really, people locally that have participated directly so far in the co-design process, both lived experience perspective and the health professional perspective, people have really contributed very richly to the discussions, and we've really appreciated that, and I hope people can start to see that in the information here, but now it's over to you to participate in the survey, to spread the word. It's really, really important that we get all of those missing voices that we've already heard need to be in this conversation. So please share this link far and wide. We're now actually about to present the health professional feedback loop as well. And so you're also welcome to look at that. That'll be a link on the landing page of the Roses website for your local LHD. Tina, was there anything you wanted to add?
So we've got a question from one of the people who's joining us on the webinar. This person says they have a question about employment with lived experience. Is it possible for that person to let us know what their question is? Might just give them a moment. If anyone else has questions too, you're more than welcome to use the button on the screen to ask those. So I do believe that there is someone who has a question. Just give them a moment.
I think I'm just noticing that we're pushing up against the limits of time here. Perhaps if someone does have a question, we'd really encourage you to just email Roses in the Ocean. We're hoping that people will have that email. Is that right, Tina? That would be available perhaps?
Yeah, so the question,
oh, here we go. Thanks.
Will be a quick one to answer. It says on an application, once you disclose that you have lived experience, you kind of get rejected. To that person, I'm sorry that you've had that experience when you applied for jobs. The lived experience of suicidal crisis is actually one of the requirements for the SPP worker roles. It's not something that people get rejected for. It's actually what we're looking for in a worker. So thank you for your question there. I might hand over to you, Carrie, to wind things up.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Perhaps we can come back to full Zoom now.
Yes.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for taking, as I said, for taking the time to join us, and those that are watching this recording. Can't stress enough how important it is to complete the survey. It really means that we can provide very meaningful information to the LHD about what people locally are saying about what's needed and how to meet those needs. So yeah, appreciate all of the time and energy and passion that people have shown and contributed so far to the process, and we're looking forward to seeing you again soon.